great to be with you. In a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I just wanted in the seminar to highlight some of the different ways in which the Bible might support or be used in at the current age of environmental crisis, the different ways that ideas in the Bible, points of relevance can be found, and perhaps also places where there's not a consonance, where we might have questions about how relevant the Bible is in our 21st century world. But I hope above all that to spark conversation, and I'm not really doing a sort of a systematic overview, I'm throwing out some nuggets, and I hope you'll pick up on some of those, and there'll be points of interest that can feed into questions and discussion. I'm unashamedly, as an Old Testament Hebrew Bible scholar, you're going to find that much of what I talk about is taken from the Old Testament. It's not to say that the New Testament isn't relevant, obviously is especially relevant in the Christian tradition, and we can pick up on ways that the New Testament might come in if there are questions about that. But I wanted to just front that up. It's my area of expertise is the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, so I tend to focus in on that. Right, I'm just going to share my screen and my PowerPoint. Oh, not that one. Yes, that's it. Can everybody see that? Can I have a thumbs up if people?
Good. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you. I wanted to start off by kind of backtracking a little bit, because certainly when I started my research career working on this, I'd got a lot of people, both religious people and people with no faith, saying, well, what on earth has religion to do with the environment? And especially from the perspective of a Western secular society where religion has become privatized and very detached and perhaps not so influential in the public sphere, you can understand that question. And I just want to remind us of probably things we already know, and highlight some interesting features in answer to that question: what has religion to do with the environment? And the first and obvious one is, of course, that a large proportion of the world's population would self-identify as belonging to a religious faith of some kind. Only 16% on this pie chart would say they are non-religious in its broadest sense. So that means that actually, for the vast majority of the world's population, religion is not something that they hear about or dismiss. It's something that's part of their worldview, their lived experience. And of course, in most other parts of the world than Western Europe, religion is inextricably linked with politics, with the social and community life, and you can't really separate them out. So that's a very Western perspective that's held by a lot of secular conservation biologists and conservation organizations, that religion is irrelevant and has nothing to contribute, which is not borne out by the evidence across the world. But then another really interesting thing that I discovered is that I just got to work out how to change screens. A number of secular scientists have been calling for people of faith to take this seriously. This is a survey in the UK of leading experts on environmental issues, and they were asked which are the 50 things that will save the planet. And it was ranked in order from 50 right up to number one. Well, number one was, perhaps unsurprisingly, about energy use. It was called change a light bulb, in the time when we didn't use LED lights. But the second thing on their list was a call to religions to step up and for their adherents to really take note. The survey said it's time that the world's faiths reminded us that we have a duty to save the planet, and they need to get us on board with that. So sort of passing the buck, but also a little bit of a call from people that have no particular faith perspective to people of faith. And this was borne out by another scientist who said this: I used to think that the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. And this is a leading professor in Harvard, speaking actually at a joint meeting between some American Christians and Harvard scientists. And I just thought it's really telling that he identifies, A, that science can't solve moral problems, selfishness, greed, apathy, and that transformation, spiritual transformation, is needed. And certainly in the Christian tradition, which I'm part of, you know that in a way is what the Christian message is all about: transformation, spiritual transformation, and then its impact in society. So this is a call from a secular world to people of faith, and suggests to me that actually there's more thinking to be done, and there's more that we can say about it. I want to think a little bit now, move more specifically to think about the scripture, the Bible, the Christian scriptures. And I want to think briefly now, talk briefly about how, if you look at the Jewish and the Christian traditions, who both have as their scriptures the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, there's a very different emphasis in how they have picked up the biblical traditions in their account of environmental sustainability in the 21st century. So in the Christian tradition, for example, and I'm only giving examples, the metaphor of stewardship is very prevalent. It's ubiquitous in a lot of Christian statements on the environment. For example, this one from the Church of England: Christians believe that this world belongs to God and that he has entrusted it to humankind. We're in the position of stewards, tenants, curators, trustees, or guardians, whether or not we acknowledge this responsibility. And by and large, the notion of stewardship comes from a few ideas in the Bible, but most particularly this verse from Genesis chapter 2, which is describing the creation of the first human, and how he's given the responsibility to tend the garden. And the idea of humans as stewards, I think, draws a lot from this concept. But as I say, it's very much part of the Christian tradition to think in terms of stewardship. If we turn to the Jewish tradition, which draws on the same scriptures, I found that there are two particular notions that crop up a lot in Jewish writing about the environment. The first is Shabbat Haaretz, which is Sabbath for the land, which draws on some texts from the book of Leviticus and elsewhere, which we'll come to a little bit later on. And then the second is the notion of Bal Tashit, which literally means do not destroy. And we'll come across the reference to that in a moment. And one Jewish commentator was writing about a program in Israel in particular, the notion of Shemitah, which is about ensuring Sabbath for the land and a restoration of the land back to a state of in the Hebrew shalom, of being at peace, of having its Sabbath. It's about not overusing land. It's about not exploiting it. It's about biodiversity. It's about all kinds of things. And she said, a major challenge for modern Jewry is to restore true observance of Shemitah, since the modern state Israel has not found a way of honoring the requirement to let the land rest, but has rather found ways around the law. So that's a calling. She's calling fellow Jews back to really take seriously the principle of Shabbat haaretz and the rest for the land, the Sabbath for the land. In both traditions, and this happens in many traditions, often there are particular sort of single verses or texts that are drawn on to highlight the responsibility that we have for this world. And here are two that are often used in environmental concerns. The first is where the Jewish notion of Bal Tashit comes from. If you besiege a town for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you must not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. You may take food from them, you must not cut them down. Are trees in the field human beings that they should come under siege from you? So that principle of not destroying what is there in the natural world is highlighted. And then in further on in Deuteronomy, if you come on a bird's nest in any tree on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledglings or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. And that idea of preserving life in order to keep continuity is there in that verse. And those are often cited to be examples, if you like, of how we should behave in the 21st century. There are arguments that perhaps suggest these are not perhaps as shall we say, nature friendly as one might think. There may be argued to be an economic reason behind them, but that's just an example of how these are texts that can be used and are used to support environmental sustainability. But I want to move out from these sort of what you might call proof texts or individual texts to something more broader. And I'm going to quote now from the Old Testament scholar Christopher Wright, where he addresses the fact that there was not the same level of environmental issues in ancient Israel as we have now. He says, ancient Israel may not have been anxious or fearful about the plight of the physical planet in the way we are, for the very good reason that we have made a far greater mess of it than the ancient world ever did. So to that extent, many aspects of what we would regard as urgent ecological issues were not explicitly addressed within the Old Testament. Nevertheless, the theological principles and ethical implications that they did articulate regarding creation do have a far-reaching impact on how biblically sensitive Christians will want to frame their ecological ethics today. And I think it's that phrase, theological principles and ethical implications, that I want to pick up on in the rest of this seminar, thinking both from theology and ethics. What are the kind of principles? What's the big picture that we can find in the Christian scriptures that might have impact on a view of environmental sustainability in the 21st century? So let's think first. I want to draw the picture very, very broad and think about the big picture, the meta-narrative, if you like, of the Bible. And when I'm using the term Bible, I am meaning Old Testament and New Testament. I'm talking from the perspective of Christian scriptures. Quite a lot of what I narrow down to when we're talking about the Old Testament Hebrew Bible will be equally relevant for in the Jewish context, but I can't speak for that. And you know, if there are people from that tradition on the call, it'd be good to hear your perspective. But certainly, let's think about the Bible's bigger picture from the perspective of the Christian tradition. And the first is to say that it has a narrative arc. It is a story, if you like. N.T. Wright, the New Testament theologian, calls it a drama in 5 acts. And the early church adopted that narrative to describe the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And the 5 acts are creation, fall, Israel, Christ, and the church and the second coming. Other Christian speakers have picked up on those 5 acts to talk from an environmental point of view. Dave Bookless, in his book Planet Wise, draws on that 5 act drama to explore the biblical text from the perspective of environmental sustainability. If I'm giving a talk, which I do frequently to theological students, Christian theological students, I actually have a narrative framework of 4 headings, which is creation, covenant, Christ, and completion, under which I sit an environmental theology. I'm actually not going to unpick either of those frameworks in detail today, because I want to talk more broadly. But suffice it to say that there's a unity, there's an overarching framework that we'll dive into a little bit more later, but that undergirds the Christian Bible. But then the second thing I want to say, which is particularly relevant in the Old Testament, is the sense of place and rootedness that pervades the text. The land is of crucial importance, not just politically as something to be fought over, but as a place of settlement, a place of being rooted, a place of safety and security. And of course, that sense of place is something that we all experience as well today. We are all people wanting to belong somewhere. And the tragedy of refugees and asylum seekers is that circumstances have forced them to leave their place, to uproot themselves and to try and find roots elsewhere. And that sense of the importance of belonging somewhere is something that pervades the biblical text. And it's relevant for environmental concerns, I think, because unless we understand place and the place where we are, I don't think we fully appreciate the trauma and the damage that is being done to place throughout the world. And by appreciating our own sense of place, we are better able to understand the placelessness and the destruction of place that goes on across the world. The third thing I want to say about the Bible's bigger picture, and this is kind of a countering a narrative that I think has come across in Christian theology over certainly the last couple of hundred years in the Western Protestant tradition in particular. The Bible is the story of God and the whole world. It's not wholly the story of God and people, or God and the children of Israel and the early church. It's the story of God and God's world. To narrow it down to just the story of God and people is to make the frame of reference far too narrow. And that has implications for the way we view the rest of God's world. And certainly there are examples from early church fathers, Augustine through Aquinas to the reformers, which tended to regard the rest of creation as the backdrop to God, the God-human story, and to see the rest of the world simply as a kind of resource basket to provide what humans need. And you can see how that has implications for how we deal with a world where there are increasingly scarce resources. Having that attitude perhaps has legitimated exploitation of the world's resources in a number of different arenas. Then, just to be more specific about the text, if you take the Christian Bible, the story of God and God's world is framed by creation. It begins with creation in Genesis chapter 1 at the very beginning, and it ends with new creation in Revelation chapter 21. That framing of creation makes, in my view, creation the kind of overarching framework for the whole of the biblical story. And picking up on the fact that it's the story of God and the whole world, there are many places, particularly in the Old Testament, where the other than human creatures and nature, natural world, creation is really, really significant. And I've put a couple of references there: Job chapters 38 to 40, Psalm 104. Other than human creation has a real role to play that is not just a resource and something that is there in the background for the God-human story. And then finally, in terms of the big picture, just to give it a sort of visual element. In a lot of the research I've done, I've worked on the principle of interconnections and something that I call the ecological triangle. And here's a little diagram of it. And the idea behind that is God is center stage. He's at the, he is above everything. And human beings and the non-human creation are both created. They're not God. And they're meant to be not only in relationship with God. Human beings are not only meant to be in relationship with God, but in relationship with the rest of God's creation. And in many places in the biblical text, you can see how that relationship, the relationship between God and humans, is fractured, but also the relationship between humanity and the natural world, the rest of creation, is also fractured. And you can also, and we'll see some examples of how God and God's creation, when it doesn't involve humans, are in a very close dynamic relationship in a number of different ways. So I've mentioned already that the overarching framework is that of creator and creation. From Genesis to Revelation, the narrative sits between those two bookends, if you like. And I just want to think a little bit more about that from a theological point of view. And then we're going to move into thinking about some ethical principles that arise in the text. So the first thing is to say that God is creator. And here are several references. This is God's world. It belongs to him. It doesn't belong to human beings. God creates everything. He creates a world fit for purpose. God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31 tells us. And there are different ways of interpreting the very good. I interpret it as being a world that does what it's supposed to do. It functions in the way that it's meant to function. It does it in a way that means that the whole operates better than the individual parts. There's an interconnectedness to it. If you like, it's an ecological system that works in the way that it's meant to. And Psalm 104 reminds us that the notion of wisdom is a really important one in the Christian tradition. And the idea that God created in wisdom suggests that there is something of God's creativity and God's self imparted into the creation that has been made. And we might want to then ask the question, well, why? Why does God create? Why does the world exist? What is its function and purpose? If it's not just to be resources for human being, why does the rest exist? And here we do find several aspects in the Old Testament. The Psalms tell us that the heavens are, that's the night sky, tells the glory of God. The firmament, the universe, proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. So creation's purpose is to reflect something of God and God's glory and God's creativity and some aspect of godliness that is present within the created world. In another psalm, Psalm 148, we read that the whole of creation is commanded to praise God, and that's animate creation, animals, birds, humans, but also inanimate trees, rocks, mountains. So the notion is very clear in the Old Testament that the purpose of creation is to praise God. And that's actually something we assume is just the prerogative of human beings. That's what we do. That's what we do when we gather in our religious communities, is to praise and worship God. But in the Bible, it suggests that the whole of creation is invited to praise God. And of course, then the question comes to mind from a sort of a response to that. What happens if, as human beings, we damage part of that creation, or we trash it, or we pollute it so that it cannot offer its praise to God? We're culpable of hindering the rest of creation from doing what it was meant to do. And on a more negative side, we'll come to a couple of texts later on which talk about how the rest of creation laments and mourns the sinfulness of human beings and cries out against the injustice that humans perpetrate on one another. So the creation has both positive aspects of reflecting God and praising God, but also being a voice in the world to remind us of what we are doing that is not right. Okay, then just quickly to end this section, where do human beings fit within this? Genesis reminds us that we are part of creation. We share in creatureliness. We are, according to Genesis 2, formed from the dust of the ground, and so too are the animals and the birds formed of the dust of the ground. And then later on it talks about us returning to dust. Psalm 104 very much locates human beings as one species amongst many who look to the natural world for our sustenance, plants, grass, but also acknowledging that comes from God. But again, we are one amongst many. And then Genesis 1 talks about our creation in the image and likeness of God, which suggests not a sense of privilege or godlikeness, or that we are somehow not creatures, but that we have unique responsibilities. And of course, as human beings, we are the only species that can profoundly affect, for good or bad, the environments of other species, other people on the other side of the world. And that's what's happening at the moment. The way we use energy and discharge carbon dioxide in the West adversely affects those humans and other species in other parts of the world. And that is a unique prerogative of human beings, that we have this ability to damage other species in other parts of the world. But equally, our abilities mean that we have the possibility of changing and reversing what we've done and making things, restoring things, if we really want to, if we really take it seriously. So that's a responsibility that we bear, both a positive and a negative. Okay, I want to move on now to think about some, if you like, more ethical frameworks that come up as we read the Old Testament. And the first is the notion of cause and effect, the idea that actions have consequences. And underlying this, the sort of background to this from in the Old Testament and also in the New, is that there are standards of behavior to which people should adhere. The children of Israel were called to a particular standard of behavior. And so too in the early church, the newly formed Christians were called to a standard of behavior. And the effect of those standards not being adhered to spills way beyond human beings into the rest of creation. These are some verses from the book of Hosea. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel, for the Lord has an indictment against the inhabitants of the land. That is the Israelites. There is no faithful or loyalty, no knowledge of God in the land. Swearing, lying, murder, stealing and adultery break out. Bloodshed follows bloodshed. Therefore, the land mourns, and all who live in it languish, together with the wild animals and the birds of the air, even of the fish of the sea are perishing. This is an example of a cause and effect sequence whereby faithfulness to God has gone, and therefore issues in society become fractured. There's violence. The moral framework, if you like, moral accountability breaks down. And then at the end, therefore, says the prophet, the land mourns and all who live in it languish. Even the wild animals, the birds of the air, even the fish of the sea are perishing. Very clearly a cause and effect between neglecting God, societal breakdown, and effect on the land, the creation. We can't tell now what Hosea had in mind when he wrote those words, what kind of a breakdown he was thinking about. But it's quite easy to see how these have resonance in our current situation, where the sequence of cause and effect plays out over and over again in society and in the wider world. The language of pollution is something that the Old Testament uses quite a bit. The idea that bad behavior, that, to use the theological word, sin, neglecting God, breaching the conditions of God's covenant with humanity, has an effect on the land of polluting it. And here are just a couple of examples. So this is from Isaiah. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they've transgressed laws, violated the statutes, broken the everlasting covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left. And the laws, the statutes, and the everlasting covenant there, that's referring to there, is what's set out in the early part of the Old Testament. The covenant, that the everlasting covenant actually is referred to as the covenant with Noah in Genesis chapter 9. And the statutes and the laws are most likely the laws that Moses and the people of Israel committed to obey, that God set in place for them. But because of that breakdown of the covenant and the statutes, the earth is described as polluted. Another example is in the way that the land reacts when pollution happens. This is from the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. And in this story, Cain kills his brother Abel, and then God accosts him and says, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. You're cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You'll be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Very graphic picture that the spilling of blood on the ground has somehow changed the dynamic between not just God and Cain, but actually the ground and Cain as well. And the land is polluted and cursed because of that spilt blood. And then another graphic example from Leviticus, where the Israelites are commanded by God to keep the statutes and the laws and observe them, so that the land to which I bring you to settle in may not vomit you out. And that graphic description of how the Israelites might lose the prerogative to be in the land is giving agency to the land. The land will vomit them out. The land will not be able to stand them, having them in any longer, and will eject them. We'll come back to that idea a little bit in a moment. The Old Testament has a very strong call for justice towards the poor, and the prophets, a number of the prophets of the Old Testament, are very strong in condemning those who exploit and trample on the poor. Here's an example. This is an example of land grab, which was happening then in 8th century Israel and still goes on today. And the prophet says, "Woe, you who join house to house, who add field to field, until there is no room for no one but you, and you're left alone in the midst of the land. The Lord of hosts has sworn in my hearing, surely many houses shall be desolate, large and beautiful houses without inhabitant." So this is addressed to a rich elite, the educated, possibly members of the royal court, who are engaged in appropriating the land that belongs to poor farmers, small-scale farmers, their ancestral land, and are appropriating it and probably making the land owners indentured slaves to work the land for a pittance. Let's see, I think I've got another example here. This is an example, well, Pope Francis in his encyclical Laudato Si talks about hearing the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and makes the point that you can't separate environmental justice from social justice. And certainly, whereas perhaps there used to be 20 years ago a sense of tension between the two, environmental justice and social justice, actually they are now so integrated that we cannot separate them. The fact that the impact of environmental injustice on the poor is so strong that social justice and environmental justice are inextricably connected. We cannot separate one from the other. And here's an example from the Book of Amos. And this is one reference that I referred to earlier about the creation calling to account the people for their exploitation. "You that trample on the needy, bring to rule the poor of the land," saying, "When will the new moon be over and we may sell grain, and the Sabbath we may offer wheat for sale?" And the text actually goes on to say with unjust scales. So it's exploiting by forcing people to buy grain, but at exploited prices, and buying and selling for unfair gain. Then the text goes on to say, "The Lord sworn by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of their deeds. Shall not the land tremble on this account, and everyone mourn who lives in it?" This level of injustice has an impact on the land and brings the land to mourning or lamenting and crying out against injustice. The Old Testament doesn't just condemn exploitation and injustice, but it calls for a positive compassion. "Love your neighbor as yourself," says Leviticus. And notice, "Love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord." This isn't something that is detached from all that Israel and now Christians believe about who God is. It's part of acknowledging that God is God, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Isaiah spells it out. "Learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow," a cry for social justice. And then probably my favorite, from Micah chapter 6, He's told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And so the mandate from the Old Testament for behavior is about thinking of the other, putting the other person, and I would argue the rest of creation, above ourselves, thinking about what we do and what impact it has on the rest of creation. Just do a little time check. I'm going to come to an end very shortly. I want to just pick up on the idea of Sabbath rest. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but going back to the book of Leviticus, this idea of Sabbath rest is where every 7 years the land has a Sabbath, a year off, a year when no cultivation takes place and people just live over what grows. So this idea and the purpose of it is, as Leviticus points out, you eat what the land yields during its Sabbaths, you, your male and female slaves, your hired and your bound laborers, your livestock also, and the wild animals in your land, all its yield shall be for food. So that is a rest that benefits not just the landowner, but those that are enslaved by them, those that are their hired laborers, the wild animals as well. It's a redressing of an imbalance that perhaps sees the landowner as benefiting wholly from the land. And then the idea of rest for the land, again, this I forgot to put the reference, this is Leviticus 26. It's talking about the time which Leviticus and other books in the Pentateuch build up to, where the Israelites are no longer allowed to live in their land. They have failed to adhere to God's commands, and so they have been conquered by the Babylonians and taken into exile. And Leviticus forewarns that what will happen when that exile takes place is the land shall enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate while you're in the land of your enemies. The land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath years as long as it lies desolate. It shall have the rest it did not have on your Sabbaths when you were living on it. And so that's also the connection between human failure, human moral culpability, and the way that the land has been exploited, the way the land has been treated, means that it hasn't had the rest, and that will be something that comes about as a result of the Israelites going into exile. Changing tack slightly, one of the principles, if you like, enshrined in the quote from Micah that I just read out, which talked about walking humbly with your God, is the principle of restraint. And certainly it's one of the virtues that the ancient church adhered to, the principle of frugality. Here's a couple of references that help to support that idea. We've seen this one already from Deuteronomy. It's about letting the mother go, taking only what you need, if you like. This is about taking what you need for yourself, the eggs from the nest, but not the mother. And here's a quote from the Jewish medieval commentator Nachmanides, who said, commenting on this verse, he says, "Now the person who kills the mother and the young in one day, or takes them when they are free to fly, it's regarded as though they have destroyed that species." So even in the Middle Ages, a sense of the need to preserve species, to not take everything that you can, but to exercise restraint. And then the idea of using what you need and not from a principle of greed, which is, as I'm sure you know, a saying attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. This is the story of God providing miraculous food called manna for the Israelites when they were in the wilderness, a fine flaky substance as fine as frost on the ground. And Moses tells the Israelites, it's the bread the Lord has given you to eat. And then the Lord has commanded, he says, gather as much of it as you need. 1 omer, that's a measure to a person, according to your number of people, all providing for those in their tents. And the story goes on to tell how some of the people thought they'd gather more than they needed, so they didn't have to do it the following day, and they gathered up more than a day's worth, and it went mouldy overnight in their tents. And the principle there in that story, from the point of view of environmental sustainability, is to think about what we need and not to be greedy for what we don't need or we might need tomorrow, to think only of what is essential for us, to consider our consumerism, if you want to put it in 21st century language, what we buy, how we spend money, what we need, what we don't need, and how we come by it. And my final section is, because I don't want to end on a sad note or a depressing note, is to say that the Christian Bible has a message of hope, and it's a message of hope and not despair. And I think it's very easy when we think about the environmental problems to get pretty despondent and to think that there's nothing much we can do about them, and they're all too big for us to contemplate changing anything. I think that the message of hope is one we need to hear. This is from the book of Isaiah. This is a reminder of a restoration of what was formerly desert and land that was decimated, desolate land. It's a reminder that the wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom, and there will be joy and singing. It's looking forward to something with hope. And that message of hope is borne out in the New Testament, in the very end of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, about a new heaven and a new earth, the sense that God is making all things new. The Greek in that Greek word new there is not a sense of kind of obliterating the old and bringing in something completely different, but a renewal, just as Isaiah looks forward to a renewal of the earth. But interestingly, a telling comment in Revelation 11, which talks about the judgment of God on human beings and says that his judgment will destroy those who destroy the earth. That's quite a sobering thought in our present context. And then finally, the idea, which is very much part of the message of the New Testament, that we live in a present sense of hope, and that there is something going on now that gives us hope for the future, but that hope now in the present, what the New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham calls imminent hope, is about what human action does to transform the world now in the anticipation of what God will do in the future. And in Romans, Paul describes it as the creation waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God, longing for the creation to obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. You might paraphrase that first bit: creation waits with eager longing for people to get their act together and to start really looking after the created world that reflects the glory of God. I'm going to stop there. I want to leave you with one final last word from the Talmud, which is Jewish commentary on the Torah. And this is actually a paraphrase of, or taken from Micah 6, verse 8. And it says, "Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it." Thanks very much.